The searchers moved in a line that was supposed to be unbroken. A human net cast across the jagged floor of the Santa Cruz Mountains. But the forest here doesn't play by the rules of geometry. The redwoods rise up like the pillars of an ancient and indifferent cathedral, their bark thick and fibrous, smelling of damp earth and a slow, simmering decay. Underfoot, the duff is a foot deep, a sponge of needles and dead wood that swallows the sound of a heavy boot before it can even echo. It was 2:15 in the afternoon when the first team reached the edge of the creek where Katherine was last seen. The water there was low, barely a trickle over slick, moss-covered stones that looked like the humped backs of sleeping reptiles. They called her name until their throats were raw and the air felt heavy with the weight of her absence. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in these woods. It isn't the absence of noise. It is a presence. It feels like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for you to stop making your own. The search dogs were brought in by 3 o'clock. Professional handlers with animals that had tracked fugitives through swamps and found bodies buried under 6 feet of snow. But when they got to that creek bed, something changed. The lead bloodhound, a beast with a nose that could find a single drop of sweat in a hurricane, stopped dead. It didn't howl. It didn't whine. It simply sat down and stared at a patch of empty air between 2 massive ferns. Its hackles were up, a rigid line of fur standing like jagged glass along its spine. The handler tried to urge the dog forward, but the animal recoiled as if it had been struck. It was as if a wall had been erected that only the dog could see or smell. In these cases, we see this over and over. The scent trail doesn't just fade out. It ends. It stops with a surgical precision that suggests the person didn't walk away, but was lifted, or simply ceased to exist in our dimension. I have seen the reports. The frustrated scribbles of men who have spent 30 years in the brush. They talk about a sudden drop in temperature, a feeling of being watched by something that doesn't have eyes, a static charge in the air that makes the hair on your arms stand up. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the shadows were stretching out like long, grasping fingers across the canyon floor. The light in the Santa Cruz Mountains doesn't fade. It retreats. It hides behind the ridges, leaving you in a teal-colored gloom where every stump looks like a crouching figure and every rustle of the wind sounds like a whispered name. The searchers were finding nothing. No torn fabric. No small footprints in the soft mud near the water. No broken twigs. It was as if 6-year-old Katherine had become a ghost before she even died. The rangers were puzzled, their brows furrowed under the brims of their hats as they looked at the maps. She was a child. She had small legs. She shouldn't have been able to cover more than a mile in that terrain before collapsing. But the miles were searched. And then the miles beyond those miles. We began to look at the holes, the places where the earth opens up. The Santa Cruz range is honeycombed with small caves and crevices, narrow throats of stone that lead down into the dark. We sent men down into them with flashlights that cut through the blackness like yellow blades. They found old bones, deer mostly, and the trash of hikers from 20 years ago. But they didn't find Katherine. What they did find was a strange, metallic smell. One searcher described it as the scent of a penny held in a sweaty palm, sharp and copper-like, vibrating in the back of his throat. It was strongest near a cluster of granite boulders that looked out of place among the redwood roots. The sun went down at 8:22, and the temperature plummeted. In the dark, the forest changes. It becomes a predatory landscape. We sat in the command trailer, the glow of the monitors casting a sickly blue light on our faces. We watched the infrared pings from the helicopters circling overhead. They were looking for a heat signature, a small, pulsing bloom of orange in the vast sea of blue and purple. But the mountain was cold. There were no blooms, just the steady, the rhythmic beat of the rotors, and the feeling that we were looking for something that had already been taken somewhere the cameras couldn't follow. The family was huddled in a tent near the trailhead, their faces hollowed out by grief and the sheer, screaming impossibility of it all. You don't lose a child in the time it takes to turn your head. You don't lose a child when there are 20 people within earshot. Unless the world isn't as solid as we think it is. Unless there are thin spots in the woods, places where the veil is worn through, like the elbow of an old sweater. We call them portals or anomalies because we don't have better words for the nightmare. We talk about high strangeness because the truth is too jagged to swallow. Katherine Wong was never found. Not that day. Not the next week. And not in the 24 years that have followed. Her disappearance remains a jagged hole in the history of the Santa Cruz Mountains. A mystery that refuses to be solved or forgotten. It mirrors the case of young Jaryd Atadero in the mountains of Colorado, who vanished in 1999 under nearly identical circumstances. A group of hikers, a short distance between the child and the adults, and then nothing but a silence that lasts a lifetime. Or the case of little DeOrr Kunz in Idaho, where the earth seemed to open up and swallow a toddler while his parents were only feet away. These are not accidents. They are subtractions. And as I sit here looking at the grainy photos of a smiling girl in a pink shirt, I can still hear the static on the radio, and the sound of the wind through the redwoods, laughing at our tiny, useless lights. The mountains do not care for your plans or your maps. They are ancient and heavy, and they possess a memory that stretches back long before we crawled out of the mud. When you walk into the Santa Cruz redwoods, you are entering a cathedral of wood and shadow, where the light has to fight its way through a canopy that is hundreds of feet thick. It was a clear afternoon in March of 1999 when the Wong family decided to take that walk. A day that started with the mundane sounds of car doors slamming and the rustle of snack bags. Katherine was only 7 years old. A bright spark of a girl in a pink sweatshirt that should have been visible from a mile away against the deep greens and browns of the forest floor. They were on the ridge trail. A path that is well traveled and clearly marked. The kind of place where you feel a false sense of security. But the forest is never truly safe. It is merely waiting for a moment of inattention. The transition from a family outing to a nightmare happened in the space of a single breath. Less time than it takes for a bird to flap its wings. One moment, Katherine was trailing just a few yards behind her mother. The next, she was simply gone. There was no scream. No sound of a struggle. No snapping of branches or the frantic sliding of dirt. It was as if the air itself had opened a mouth and swallowed her whole, leaving behind nothing but a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against the eardrums of everyone present. Her mother turned around to call her name, expecting to see that pink sweatshirt bobbing among the ferns. But there was only the flickering light of the sun hitting the redwood needles. The panic did not set in immediately. It arrived in waves. First as confusion, then as a cold trickle of sweat down the spine, and finally as a roar. Jagged scream that tore through the quiet of the afternoon. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the woods were crawling with searchers. Men and women in orange vests moved through the undergrowth with flashlights that looked like tiny, pathetic fireflies against the encroaching dark. I remember the smell of the air that evening. It was cold and carried a strange, metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat like pennies held in a sweaty palm. One veteran searcher, a man who had tracked mountain lions and lost hikers for 30 years, stopped near a cluster of granite boulders and refused to go further. He said the air felt wrong, like it was vibrating at a frequency that made his teeth ache. He described a sensation of being watched by something that was not behind the trees, but inside the very fabric of the landscape. We dismissed it as exhaustion at the time, but in the years since, I have heard that same description from people who have stood in the exact spots where others have vanished. The dogs were the first sign that this was not a normal disappearance. They were highly trained bloodhounds with noses that could find a single drop of sweat in a thunderstorm. When they were brought to the last known location of the girl, they did not catch a scent and pull at their leashes. Instead, they whimpered and tucked their tails between their legs, sinking to the ground as if they were trying to hide from the very air they were supposed to be breathing. They refused to cross an invisible line near the rock formation, a boundary that existed only in their primal instincts. It was as if Katherine had not walked away, but had been lifted vertically out of the world. We checked the trees. We checked the crevices. We checked every square inch of the mud for a footprint. But the ground was as clean as a scrubbed kitchen floor. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the temperature plummeted to 38 degrees. In the command trailer, we sat bathed in the sickly blue glow of the computer monitors, Watching the infrared feeds from the helicopters circling 500 feet above the canopy, the thermal cameras were sensitive enough to pick up the heat of a squirrel. But the screen showed only a vast sea of cold blues and purples. There were no orange blooms. No pulsing heat signatures of a small child shivering under a bush. The mountain was a frozen, indifferent slab of earth that seemed to be actively hiding its secrets from our technology. We talk about the high strangeness of these cases because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. The idea that there are places in this world where the rules of physics simply do not apply. The search continued for 10 days. An agonizing stretch of time where the hope of the family was slowly ground down into a fine, gray ash. We covered 20 square miles of the most rugged terrain in the Santa Cruz range. Diving into canyons so steep the sun only hits the bottom for 2 hours a day. We found nothing. Not a scrap of pink fabric. Not a single shoe. Not even a broken twig that could be definitively linked to a 7-year-old girl. It was as if Katherine Wong had been edited out of existence. A glitch in the record of the universe that the forest had decided to correct. The investigation eventually went cold. The files placed in a cardboard box that gathered dust in a basement. But for those of us who were there, the case never truly ended. It stays with you. A low hum of unease that vibrates in your bones whenever you walk under the shade of a tree. I often think about the boulders near the ridge. The way the light seemed to distort around them like heat rising off a summer road. There are theories about these things. Ideas about magnetic anomalies or portals that open and close based on celestial alignments or unknown biological triggers. Some people talk about the hidden folk. Others talk about extraterrestrial harvesters. But I have come to believe it is something much older and more fundamental. I believe there are thin spots in the world. Places where the veil between what we know and what we fear is worn through like the elbow of a discarded sweater. Katherine Wong walked into one of those thin spots. And she simply kept walking into a place where our lights cannot reach. The forest did not take her. The forest is merely the container for a predatory mystery that we are not equipped to understand. 24 years have passed since that March afternoon. And the trees have grown taller, their roots wrapping deeper around the stones of the ridge. The Wong family has moved away, trying to build a life on top of a hole that can never be filled. But the mountain remains. It is still there, waiting for the next person to turn their head for 5 seconds. The next person to step off the path to look at a flower or a strange rock. The silence in those woods is not the absence of sound. It is a presence in itself. A heavy, watching weight that reminds you that you are a guest in a place that does not want you. We call these events disappearances because we need a word that fits in a police report. But in reality, they are subtractions from the sum of the world. This case is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern that defies logic and geography. It mirrors the disappearance of young Jaryd Atadero in the mountains of Colorado in 1999. A child who vanished while walking between 2 groups of adults on a trail. Just like Katherine. There was no sound and no tracks. Only a sudden, impossible absence. It brings to mind the case of little DeOrr Kunz in the remote mountains of Idaho, where a toddler vanished from a campsite while his parents were only 20 feet away, leaving behind no evidence of a struggle or a predator. Even the case of Dennis Martin in the Great Smoky Mountains follows this jagged script. A boy who disappeared in the time it took his father to turn his head during a game of hide-and-seek. These children were not lost. They were taken by something that leaves no footprint and triggers no alarm. Something that hides in the static of the forest and the long shadows of the redwoods.